All right, welcome everyone to today's Explainer. I'm going to be stepping into the role of your corporate sustainability consultant today. And hey, don't worry, I promise I won't bill you by the hour for this one. We are going to look at the hard economic realities of environmental regulations. So we're moving right past all the typical PR spin, and we're focusing strictly on your bottom line. We're going to explore how environmental impacts, what the economists like to call externalities, how they directly alter your production costs, and honestly, more importantly, how you can actually turn those regulatory hurdles into a distinct, measurable competitive advantage.
So here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll touch on uncovering hidden value, pricing pollution, cap and trade, tax versus market outcomes, and finally, property rights risk. Okay, let's just dive right into this.
Starting with Section 1, Uncovering Hidden Value Created.
Okay, so in economics, a positive externality happens when the value that society gets from an action actually outpaces our own internal demand curve. The gap between those two things, that's called the marginal external benefit. You really need to think of this as a hidden business metric. It's essentially a massive missed financial opportunity. You see, without any outside intervention, a self-interested firm is only going to invest and produce right up to the point where our private benefit meets our marginal cost. But by stopping right there, we actually leave a huge amount of optimal societal value just sitting on the table, completely unmonetized. Now, you'll see a classic example here about water purification, but let's actually try a different analogy to really visualize this in a manufacturing context. Imagine we decide to build a massive, heavy-duty access highway to connect our remote manufacturing plant to the main interstate. Now, we are doing this strictly to lower our own shipping delays and maintenance costs. But here's the positive externality. By building that road, we inadvertently create a high-speed shortcut for the entire surrounding town. Suddenly, local logistics companies, and even worse, our direct competitors, can use our road, drastically lowering their transit times. We basically just gave them a free ride. We created all this value, and we aren't getting paid a dime for it. So the divide here is super clear, right? Our private benefit is just our own internal operational efficiency. But the total societal benefit, that includes those shared infrastructure improvements and the lower operating costs for everyone else in the industry. If we were actually being compensated for that total societal benefit, our efficient level of investment would be much, much higher. It would be governed by the intersection of the marginal social benefit and our marginal cost, not just our private demand. Realizing this gap exists is absolutely crucial. It's the very first step in, say, negotiating a co-investment from the local government, or maybe demanding some heavy local tax breaks. All right, moving on to Section 2, pricing the cost of pollution.
So let's flip the script. When our factories emit pollutants, there's a real cost to society, like health impacts or environmental degradation, and that cost isn't currently reflected in our private production costs. Regulators try to correct this using what's called a Pigouvian tax. Just think of this as a super strict emission fee. It's a charge levied on absolutely every single unit of a firm's emissions, carefully calculated to equal the marginal external cost. Suddenly, the total social cost literally becomes our private cost plus the tax. This isn't just an academic theory anymore. It's a direct line-item hit to our P&L statement.
Let's walk through a theoretical P&L calculation straight from the economic models to see the damage. Before any regulation hits, our firm's marginal cost to produce a widget is just a flat $5. We pay exactly zero for the external cost of our emissions. But when regulators step in and decide the socially optimal tax is $4 per unit, which represents that marginal external cost, well, everything changes. Take a look at that post-tax calculation. Our total effective cost, it just spiked to $9 per unit. That is a massive margin compression, and it demands some immediate shifts in our operational strategy.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how this new cost structure completely alters corporate behavior. Because we are now forced to pay that $4 tax on every single unit of emission, we are heavily financially motivated to install pollution abatement equipment. In fact, we're going to keep lowering our emissions right up until the point where the emission fee exactly equals our marginal cost of abatement, or MCA. Simply put, if it costs us $3 to clean up a unit of pollution, we'll absolutely do it to avoid paying the $4 tax. It's just smart business.
Now, from a regulatory perspective, this tax definitely has its pros and cons. The pros? Well, it's fairly easy for governments to administer, and it obviously fills up their coffers. Plus, it's highly economically efficient because it basically forces firms to find the absolute cheapest ways to reduce emissions. But the cons? It requires regulators to perfectly guess the exact dollar cost of a damaged ecosystem, which is, let's be honest, nearly impossible. And crucially for us, there is no absolute guarantee on the final quantity of emissions reduced. If demand for our product suddenly spikes, we might just decide to eat the tax and keep polluting anyway. And that creates a massive operational forecasting risk for us when regulators inevitably try to hike up the tax rate later on.
Okay, Section 3. We're looking at the cap and trade strategy.
So, what exactly are transferable emission permits? They are marketable rights allocated to firms which allow for a specific legal limit of pollutants. If you want to emit, you absolutely must hold a permit for it. But I really want to emphasize the word marketable here. That is the key difference from a static C. These permits are fluid assets. They can be bought and sold independently on an open market. It's like a stock exchange, but for pollution.
So here is how this marketplace actually functions in the real world. First, the government sets a hard total emission cap for the entire industry. Then, our firm receives a specific allocation of those permits. But here is where the strategy really kicks in. If we innovate and figure out a way to reduce our emissions cheaply, we don't need all of our permits anymore, right? So we can take our surplus and sell it on the open market to competitors who are really struggling to reduce theirs. We literally just turned our internal emission abatement capabilities into a brand new revenue stream. On the flip side, if cleaning up our factory is just ridiculously expensive, we have the flexibility to just buy extra permits to cover our deficit.
Which brings us to Section 4, comparing tax versus market outcomes.
There is a massive strategic divide between these two policies, and you really have to understand the difference. A Pigouvian tax gives us a predictable, fixed per-unit cost. It is a rigid fee. We dynamically adjust our production and abatement around that one fixed number. Tradable permits, on the other hand, they represent a fluctuating strategic cost. Sure, the industry has a hard cap on pollution, but we have incredible operational agility. If our marginal cost of abatement is much lower than the industry average, cap and trade is a huge competitive advantage for us. We can literally out-innovate our rivals, sell them our extra permits at a premium, and effectively force them to subsidize our own R&D. It's a game changer.
Finally, Section 5, property rights as risk management. I really want you to consider this provocative question for a second. Who actually owns the clean air around our factory? I know, it sounds super philosophical, but it's pure economics. Traditionally, if no one legally owns the air, a firm has absolutely zero incentive to include the external costs of air pollution in its production calculations. If property rights aren't clearly defined, externalities just run wild because the resource is essentially free to exploit.
And this brings us to the famous Coase theorem. It argues that if property rights are well-defined and transaction costs are low, private parties can actually negotiate to an efficient outcome without the government ever getting involved. For us, this is the ultimate modern risk management strategy. If local stakeholders, let's say a surrounding residential neighborhood, actually hold the legal rights to clean air, we are immediately forced to internalize our pollution costs. We've got a few choices. We drastically reduce our emissions, we cease production entirely, or we negotiate a financial settlement directly with that community to compensate them. Proactive companies have to preemptively integrate these potential community negotiations, buyouts, and lawsuits directly into their operational risk matrices. The stakes literally couldn't be higher here.
So I'll leave you with this ultimate question for your executive board. Are you going to view the cost of pollution merely as a passive regulatory penalty, just another unavoidable cost of doing business? Or are you going to recognize it as a strategic variable, one that you can actively manage, trade on the open market, and use to outmaneuver your slower competitors? Look, sustainability is no longer just a compliance blind spot. It is the absolute frontier of operational strategy. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today. I really hope this gives you the framework to take these economic realities and turn them into your next great competitive advantage. See you next time.